There are no signs of forced entry, no broken objects, no overturned furniture, and no visible struggle.
Everything in the room looks perfectly clean and undisturbed.
It was just past midnight in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Westbridge when a call came in that immediately changed the direction of an entire investigation. A woman's voice was breaking through the phone, repeating only one thing, that her husband was gone and someone had taken him inside their own home. When police arrived at the mansion, nothing on the outside suggested what they were about to walk into. No broken doors, no signs of forced entry. No panic from the security system that should have triggered instantly. Instead, they found a wealthy businessman inside his study, lifeless, positioned in a way that made the entire scene feel wrong from the very first glance. And the most disturbing detail was not how he was found, but how untouched everything around him still looked, as if nothing inside that house had been disturbed at all. They would later confirm something even more confusing. Nothing valuable had been taken, not a single item was missing. No clear motive showed itself in those first moments, order and a situation that refused to explain itself. And while officers began documenting the scene, one question started to spread through the investigation faster than any answer could catch up with. How does someone end a man like this inside a sealed home and leave everything exactly as it was? Before we go any deeper into this story, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how many different places our viewers are joining us from. And if you enjoy real stories filled with mystery, betrayal, shocking twists, and unforgettable endings, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It really helps support the channel and allows us to keep bringing you more stories like this. Now, with that said, let's go back to the night that changed everything. It all began long before that midnight call in Westbridge, in a life that looked perfect from the outside but carried cracks that most people never noticed until it was too late. The man at the center of this story was a wealthy American businessman in his early 50s, known for building a financial empire from nothing but discipline, risk, and a reputation for never trusting anyone fully, not even the people closest to him. To the public, he was a success. The kind of man people pointed to as proof that hard work still meant something in America. But behind closed doors, he lived a very different reality, one shaped by control, silence, and decisions he rarely explained to anyone, including his wife. His wife came from a quieter world, not poor, but far from the level of wealth she eventually entered. Friends described her as patient, observant, and emotionally steady, the kind of person who adapted rather than resisted. When they met, it looked like timing brought them together. But those who knew them later said it felt more like two very different lives learning how to share the same space. In the beginning, everything moved quickly: marriage, business expansion, public appearances that made them look untouchable. They were often described as a power couple, admired, even envied, but admiration is not the same as understanding, and over time, small things began to shift in ways that didn't raise alarm at first, but slowly created distance that neither of them openly addressed. There were nights when he came home late without explanation, phone calls he took privately and ended too quickly when she entered the room, financial documents that were kept in locked spaces she was never invited into. At first, she didn't question it, because wealth often comes with secrecy, and she believed that trust meant not asking too many questions. But in a life built on silence, silence eventually starts to speak, and what it began to reveal was that something between them was changing long before anyone outside their home could ever notice. At first, the changes were so subtle they could easily be dismissed as stress, business pressure, or the normal distance that comes with a life built around money and responsibility. But for the wife, there were moments that didn't sit right, moments she couldn't explain even to herself. It started with routines that suddenly shifted without warning, dinner plans that were forgotten, conversations that ended earlier than they used to, and a growing pattern of silence that replaced what used to be small, ordinary exchanges between them. The husband had always been private, but now privacy felt different. He wasn't just private with the world. He was private within his own home. Files that were once casually left on desks were now locked away. His phone, once placed anywhere in the house, now stayed in his pocket even when he was asleep. And when asked simple questions about his day, his answers became shorter, more controlled, as if every word was being measured before it was spoken. One evening, something happened that the wife never forgot. She walked into his study and noticed a document on his desk that she had never seen before. It was not unusual for him to have paperwork, but what made her pause was the fact that it was already signed. Not just signed, but dated for a future time. When she asked him about it, he didn't look surprised. He didn't even seem concerned. He simply closed the folder and told her it was nothing she needed to worry about. But the way he said it was different from before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't avoidance, it was final. Around the same time, a new pattern began to appear in his business life, meetings that were suddenly moved to undisclosed locations, phone calls taken outside the house late at night, and a noticeable change in the way his business partners interacted with him. As if conversations had become more careful, more guarded, the wife tried to convince herself it was just pressure. Wealth had a way of creating distance between people, even when they lived under the same roof, but something inside her refused to settle. Then came the moment that changed everything, even though she didn't realize it at the time. One night, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the bedside table. She wasn't the kind of person who usually looked, but something about the urgency of the notifications made her pause. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. One message that simply read, "If you don't fix this, it will end badly for both of you." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The message alone was enough to sit in her mind long after the screen went dark again. When he came out, nothing about him had changed on the surface. Same calm expression, same controlled tone, but she noticed something new, a quiet awareness in his eyes, as if he already knew something was moving closer, something he had been waiting for longer than she understood. And from that night forward, The home they lived in no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like a place where something had already been set in motion, and neither of them were fully in control of what came next. The night everything changed began like any other night in the Westbridge estate. Nothing about it suggested that by morning a man would be dead and an entire family would be pulled into an investigation that would divide opinions. Across the country, the house was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. The husband had returned earlier than usual that evening, something that surprised even his wife, because for weeks his schedule had been unpredictable, often stretching late into the night without explanation. Dinner was brief. There was conversation, but it lacked warmth, as if both of them were speaking carefully around something neither wanted to name. At one point, the wife noticed him checking his phone more frequently than usual, not in distraction but in anticipation, as if waiting for something specific to happen. When she asked if everything was all right, he simply nodded and said work was complicated. Later that night, he went into his study and closed the door behind him. That detail, the closing of the door, would later be remembered by the wife more than anything else because it wasn't unusual, but it felt final in a way she couldn't explain. Around 9, the security system registered movement inside the house, but no alarms were triggered. The system had been manually adjusted earlier that day, something investigators would only discover much later. At 9:12 p.m., a brief phone call was made from the husband's personal line. It lasted less than a minute. No one knows exactly what was said during that call, but records show it was the last outgoing communication from his device. By 9:40 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing a sound from the property. Not loud enough to suggest a struggle, but enough to make them pause and look toward the mansion. They would later describe it as a single heavy impact, followed by silence. Inside the house, nothing else appeared to move after that moment. When the wife later told investigators her version of that night, she said she had gone to bed earlier than usual. She did not hear arguing. She did not hear footsteps. She did not hear anything that would suggest what was about to be discovered. That, in itself, became one of the most confusing parts of the case, because when police eventually entered the study, they found the husband seated in a position that did not match a struggle nor a natural collapse. Everything around him was intact. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no visible disturbance that explained how a man could end up dead in a room that looked untouched. But what unsettled investigators even more was not just how he was found, but how carefully the timeline seemed to hold together. Almost as if every detail of that night had already been accounted for in advance, and when they began tracing the hours leading up to his death, they discovered something that changed the entire direction of the investigation, because this was no longer just about what happened inside that room. It was about what had been prepared long before anyone realized there was danger at all. By the time investigators fully secured the mansion, the case had already begun to shift from a sudden death investigation to something far more complex. What made it difficult was not a lack of evidence, but too many pieces that didn't fit together in a normal way. The house had no signs of forced entry, yet the husband was found dead inside a locked and monitored property. There was no immediate indication of robbery, no clear weapon left behind, and no obvious struggle that would explain how the situation escalated to that point. The first suspicion naturally fell on those closest to him. His wife, his business partner, and even members of his private security team were all pulled into questioning. Each of them had access. Each of them had motive in one form or another, and each of them had details in their statements that didn't align perfectly with the timeline. Investigators were building. The wife was the first to be formally interviewed. She appeared composed, but grief does not always look the way people expect it to. Her answers were careful, sometimes too careful, as if she was trying not to say the wrong thing rather than simply recall what she knew. She insisted she had gone to bed earlier that night and did not hear anything unusual. But when asked about her husband's recent behavior, she admitted there had been distance between them, though she could not explain exactly when it began. The business partner, however, brought a different kind of attention. Financial records revealed growing tension between him and the deceased over a series of investments that had recently failed. Large sums of money were involved, and pressure had been building for weeks. When questioned, he claimed they had resolved their disagreements and insisted the relationship was still professional. But investigators noted something important. He seemed unusually prepared for the questions he was being asked. Then came the security team. One member in particular raised concerns because of a gap in the surveillance footage from the night of the incident. A short window of time had been overwritten or manually disabled. It wasn't enough to explain what happened, but it was enough to suggest that someone with technical access had altered what should have been a complete record of the night. As the investigation deepened, attention turned toward the husband's financial activities in the weeks leading up to his death. What they found was unexpected. Several major changes had been made to his accounts, including adjustments to beneficiaries and private holdings that were not publicly known. Even more unusual was the timing. Some of these changes had been made very recently, just days before his death. It raised a question that investigators could not ignore. Was he preparing for something, or had someone else been quietly restructuring his affairs without his full awareness? The deeper they looked, the more the case began to feel less like a simple act of violence and more like something carefully positioned over time. Every person connected to him now carried some level of suspicion, not because of one single action, but because of how every detail seemed to point in more than one direction at once. And then, just when investigators believed they were getting closer to understanding the financial motive, they uncovered something that completely changed the focus of the entire case, a discovery hidden in plain sight inside his private study. Something that suggested he may not have been as unaware of the danger as everyone first believed. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives returned to the husband's private study for a second, more detailed search. The room had already been processed once, but something about the consistency of the scene made them believe there was still more to uncover. Every object inside that space appeared intentionally placed, not disturbed by panic or struggle, but arranged in a way that now felt increasingly deliberate. It was inside a locked compartment beneath his desk that they found it. A small hidden section that did not appear on any of the home's original floor plan. Inside were documents that had not been part of the initial financial review, along with a sealed envelope addressed directly to investigators. The contents of that envelope would later change the entire direction of the case. Inside was a video recording. The footage showed the husband seated in the very same study where he had been found. He appeared calm, but there was something in his expression that suggested awareness rather than fear. In the recording, he spoke directly, not to anyone in the room, but to whoever would eventually find what he had left behind. He explained that over the past several months, he had begun to notice irregularities in both his personal and financial life. Accounts were being accessed at unusual times. Decisions were being influenced without his full participation, and people he once trusted had started acting differently around him. As if conversations were no longer fully transparent, he did not accuse anyone directly in the recording. Instead, he stated that if something were to happen to him under suspicious circumstances, the investigation should begin not with strangers, but with those closest to him and those who stood to gain the most from his absence. Then came the most important revelation, a revised will. It was dated just days before his death, and it completely changed the distribution of his entire estate. Everything, every major asset, property, and financial holding had been transferred to his wife. On paper, it looked final, legally binding, and carefully executed. But what made investigators pause was not just the contents of the will, but the timing. It suggested preparation, not coincidence. It suggested that the husband had been making arrangements while fully aware that something in his environment was no longer stable. The wife, when informed of the discovery, did not react in the way investigators expected. There was no immediate display of relief or shock. Instead, she appeared overwhelmed, as if the weight of the document carried a meaning far deeper than inheritance alone. She repeatedly stated she had no knowledge of the changes and had not been involved in any financial decisions of that scale. As the video and will were analyzed further, another detail emerged. The recording had not been made in a single moment. It appeared to have been created in segments, suggesting multiple instances of preparation. This raised a new question that investigators could not ignore. If he had time to record warnings and adjust his estate, then how close had he been to the danger he described? The case was no longer just about identifying a suspect. It had become an attempt to understand whether the victim had been documenting his own end in real time, and whether the truth had been hidden not after his death but before it ever happened. And just as investigators prepared to bring key individuals in for a second round of questioning, another unexpected piece of testimony surfaced, one that would challenge everything they thought they already understood about the night he died. As the investigation intensified, detectives believed they were finally closing in on a clear direction. The financial trail, the revised will, and the hidden recordings all pointed toward a carefully structured situation that involved people very close to the victim. But just as the case seemed to stabilize around a theory, a new witness came forward, someone who had not been part of the original list of suspects or associates. This individual was not a family member or business partner. They were a private contractor who had worked intermittently around the estate's security system. At first, their involvement seemed insignificant, until they made a statement that immediately caught the attention of investigators. They claimed that in the weeks leading up to the incident, there had been repeated quiet modifications to the estate's Digital Security Act, changes that were not authorized through normal administrative channels. According to their testimony, certain access points to the house were being opened and closed remotely at unusual hours, often late at night, when the household was supposed to be fully inactive. These adjustments were subtle enough not to trigger alarms, but consistent enough to suggest that someone with knowledge of the system was deliberately controlling what could and could not be recorded. This changed everything because it meant the house had not been as secure as it appeared. It also meant that whoever was involved had more than just physical access. They had understanding, familiarity, and enough control to influence what investigators would later see or miss entirely. As detectives re-examined the timeline, inconsistencies that once seemed minor now became critical. The missing gaps in surveillance footage were no longer viewed as technical failures, but as intentional blind spots. The altered security logs were no longer random glitches, but possible evidence of planning. And then came a discovery that reframed the entire investigation in a way no one expected. A second encrypted file was recovered from the husband's private system. Unlike the first recording, this one was not addressed to investigators. It was addressed to a specific individual, someone whose identity had not yet been publicly revealed in the case file. In the message, the husband spoke with a different tone, more direct, more personal, as if he was speaking to someone he already suspected but could not openly confront. He described feeling watched within his own home. He mentioned conversations that felt rehearsed by others before they were spoken. He even referenced a moment where he believed his financial decisions were being influenced without his full control over them. But he stopped short of naming anyone directly. What stood out most in the recording was not what he said, but what he implied. He believed that if anything happened to him, it would not be random. It would be the result of a chain of decisions that had been building quietly, over time, hidden behind normal business and family interactions. When this second recording was reviewed alongside the first, investigators realized something unsettling. The messages were not just warnings, they were structured, almost as if he had been documenting different layers of the same threat from different angles, carefully leaving pieces behind for someone to eventually assemble. At this stage, the case had moved beyond a simple question of who was responsible. It had become a question of how long the situation had been developing before anyone realized the outcome was already in motion. And just when it seemed the truth was finally within reach, the final revelation emerged during the closing phase of the investigation, an outcome that no one inside the courtroom or outside of it was fully prepared for. By the time the case reached its final stage, the courtroom had become more than a place of legal judgment. It had turned into a space where every detail of the husband's final days was being reconstructed piece by piece, as if everyone involved was trying to rewrite understanding from fragments left behind. The evidence had already established that his death was not random, and the financial records had already confirmed that major changes were made to his estate shortly before he died. But what still remained unresolved was the full truth behind intention, timing, and control. The focus eventually narrowed to those who had the most direct access to both his personal and financial life. Testimony from multiple witnesses created a picture that was not uniform but layered with contradictions. Some described him as increasingly cautious in the weeks before his death, making private arrangements and restricting access to sensitive information. Others insisted he appeared normal, continuing business as usual without any visible concern. Then came the moment that shifted the emotional weight of the entire trial. The wife, now positioned at the center of both grief and suspicion, her statements remained consistent with what she had previously told investigators. She maintained that she had no involvement in any financial restructuring and that she had not been aware of the revised will until after her husband's death. But what affected the courtroom most was not her words, but her reaction to the recordings that were played publicly for the first time. Hearing her husband speak from beyond that night created a moment that even the prosecution and defense did not interrupt. In those recordings, he had described a growing sense that something around him had shifted, something he could not fully define but believed was closing in slowly over. Yet he never provided a direct name, never pointed to a single person with certainty, leaving interpretation open and responsibility unconfirmed. As closing arguments began, the prosecution emphasized financial motive, opportunity, and access. The defense focused on lack of direct evidence linking any single individual to the act itself. And when the verdict was finally delivered, it resolved certain legal questions but left deeper emotional and moral questions unanswered. There was accountability established in parts of the case, but not a complete clarity that satisfied every layer of the investigation. Some elements remained circumstantial, others interpretive, and some simply impossible to confirm beyond doubt. The estate was ultimately distributed according to the final legal documents, confirming the wife as the primary beneficiary, while surrounding disputes and investigations settled in ways that left the public divided. In the end, what unsettled many people was not only what was proven, but what could never be fully proven. A man had clearly taken steps to prepare for something he feared, yet the full origin of that fear was never definitively confirmed. Multiple people had the means, motive, and opportunity to influence events around him, but no single narrative fully captured every unanswered gap in the timeline. And long after the case was closed, one question continued to follow it, both inside and outside the courtroom: whether what happened was the result of a single decision made in one moment, or the outcome of many quiet choices building over time until there was no longer a way to stop what had already been set in motion. Because sometimes in cases like this, the hardest truth is not discovering what happened. It is accepting that not everything that happened can ever be completely proven. And that remains the question people still ask today, whether justice truly reached the full truth, or only the part that could be seen clearly enough to judge.